The wind on the high plains does not whisper. It talks. It moves through dry grass like something with a purpose, like it is trying to tell you a secret before it changes its mind and takes the secret back. In the autumn of 1879, that wind carried the smell of turned earth across a stretch of Kansas territory that had no name worth remembering, until a woman nobody knew rode in on a wagon nobody recognized, carrying seed nobody could identify. She never told anyone what she was planting. By the time the first frost came, half the frontier wanted to know badly enough to kill for it. This is the story of Eliza Coldwater, 60 acres of turned soil, and a harvest that would burn a town down before it fed a single soul. The town was called Hollow Bend, a cluster of clapboard buildings sitting where a dry creek used to run before the drought of '76 killed it. 200 souls, give or take, all of them farmers, who had watched 3 seasons of wheat curl up and die in the ground. Hollow Bend was not a town that was growing. It was a town that was surviving, and barely. So when Eliza Coldwater's wagon rolled down the one street the town had, every window found a face pressed against it. She was maybe 35 years old, dressed plain, hair pulled back tight enough to suggest she had no patience for anything that wasn't useful. She did not stop at the saloon. She did not stop at the church. She rode straight past the general store and out to the abandoned Whitfield plot on the edge of town. 60 acres of hard, cracked earth that had grown nothing but resentment since old man Whitfield died of a fever 2 winters back. She bought it that same afternoon, paid in gold coin, and the storekeeper who sold her the deed, a heavy-set man named Osgood Pratt, never forgot the weight of that coin in his palm. It wasn't Union gold. It wasn't Confederate gold. It had markings he didn't recognize, filed smooth in places, like someone had tried to erase where it came from. "Where are you from, ma'am?" he'd asked her. "Away," she said, and that was the only answer Hollow Bend ever got out of her about her past. By nightfall, she had a tent up on the Whitfield plot. By the end of the week she had a small cabin, built with lumber she paid 3 men to haul from 40 miles off, men who came back talking about the seed sacks in her wagon. Canvas sacks, sewn shut, stamped with no company name, no origin, nothing but a symbol burned into the fabric, a circle split by 3 lines, like a wheel with broken spokes. Nobody in Hollow Bend had seen that mark before. Nobody would forget it after. She began plowing the very next morning, alone, with a mule she'd bought off a passing trader. She worked from the gray of first light until the dark swallowed the field whole, and she did not stop to explain herself to a single soul who wandered out to watch, and plenty did. The town doctor, a dry, careful man named Simmons, was the first to ask her outright, "What are you planting, Mrs. Coldwater?" "Miss," she corrected him, "and that's my business. Folks are curious. Folks can stay curious," she said, and went back to her plow. That should have been the end of it. In most towns, it would have been. But Hollow Bend was starving in slow motion, and starving towns do not let mysteries lie. They pick at them the way a man picks at a wound he knows he shouldn't touch. Weeks passed. Eliza's field turned from broken dirt to neat, impossible rows. Impossible because nothing in Hollow Bend grew in neat rows anymore. Not since the drought had taught every farmer that neatness was a luxury the land no longer allowed. But her rows came up green when the rest of the county was still brown. Whatever she'd planted did not seem to need the rain that never came. That was the first thing that turned curiosity into hunger. The second thing was the men. 3 of them appeared in October, strangers who took rooms at the town's one boarding house, and did not explain their business beyond saying they were surveying. They wore good coats. They asked careful questions at the saloon, always circling back to the same subject, the woman on the Whitfield place, and what she'd brought with her, and where a man might get a look at her crop without being invited. The leader of the three called himself Reeves. He was polite in the way that made polite men more frightening than rude ones, because you could tell the politeness was a tool and not a feeling. He bought drinks for anyone with information. He paid particular attention to Osgood Pratt, who remembered strange gold, and to the freight men who remembered strange seed sacks. "That symbol," Reeves said one night at the bar, sketching the broken wheel and spilled whiskey on the counter. "You said it was burned into the sacking?" "Burned deep," said the freight man. "Like it mattered." Reeves smiled the way a man smiles when a rumor he's been chasing for a long time finally puts its hand up. By the time word got back to Eliza, and word always got back to Eliza, because Hollow Bend gossiped the way it prayed, constantly and without much hope, she started keeping a shotgun on the porch of her cabin, propped where anyone riding up the road could see it plainly. She didn't point it at people. She just let them see it was there. The town's reverend, a soft-spoken man named Amos Reed, was the one who finally got closer to her than the doctor had. He brought her a jar of preserves as a neighborly gesture, and she let him sit on the porch steps while she cleaned tools. "They think you're hiding something valuable," he told her. "I am," she said. "They think it might be gold. Buried gold, maybe, and the crop's just cover for digging." She laughed at that, short and without much joy in it. "If I wanted to hide gold, Reverend, I would not have bought 60 acres of the most watched dirt in this county and planted rows a blind man could count from the church steeple." "Then what is it?" She looked at him for a long moment, the way a person looks at someone they are deciding whether to trust, and then she looked back at her rows. "Something this whole county is going to need," she said, "and something a lot of people are going to wish they'd never found out about." That answer, repeated around Hollow Bend by supper time, did nothing to calm anybody down. If anything, it did the opposite. Half the town decided she must be growing some rare medicine worth a fortune back east. The other half decided worse, that whatever she was hiding, it was dangerous enough that decent folk shouldn't be within a mile of it, and that was exactly why somebody ought to find out what it was before it found out about them. It was Osgood Pratt who broke first, and it wasn't greed alone that did it, it was debt. Pratt's store was mortgaged to a bank in Topeka that had stopped being patient with him 2 seasons ago. A man like Reeves, offering good money simply to look at a crop and report what he saw, was not a temptation Pratt had the strength to refuse. He went out to the Whitfield plot on a moonless night in late October, along with 2 of Reeves's men, cutting through the fence Eliza had strung around the field's northern edge. Not much of a fence, wire and posts, but enough to mark a boundary a decent person would respect. They weren't decent, not that night. Eliza heard the wire snap from her cabin. She was out the door with a shotgun before the 3 men had gotten 30 feet into the rows. And what happened next, nobody in Hollow Bend agrees on exactly, because everybody's account changed a little depending on who was telling it, and how much they wanted to look good in the retelling. What is certain, a shot was fired. Nobody died. Pratt took a graze along his forearm that scarred him for the rest of his life, and the 2 strangers ran hard enough that one lost a boot in the mud and never went back for it. By morning, the whole town knew, and the whole town split clean in 2. Half of them said Eliza Coldwater had every right to defend her land from trespassers and thieves in the dark. The other half said a woman who'd shoot a neighbor over a crop she wouldn't even name had something worth more than her own safety to protect, and that made her dangerous by definition. Reeves, for his part, did not run. He came to see her the next afternoon, alone, hat in hand, all the careful politeness dialed up as far as it would go. "That was a misunderstanding, Miss Coldwater," he said. "My associates overstepped." "Your associates trespassed on my land in the dark," she said. "There's no misunderstanding a fence. I'll be straight with you." He crouched, picked up a handful of the black soil from the edge of her rows, let it run through his fingers. "I've been tracking that seed mark, the broken wheel, for 3 years, across 2 territories. I know what it means. I know what grows under it when it's done right, and I know what it's worth to the right buyers. I'm not here to steal from you. I'm here to offer you a partnership that would make both of us rich men, beg your pardon, rich people, before the year's out." "I don't want to be rich," Eliza said. "I want to bring in a harvest. Everyone wants to be rich once they understand what they're sitting on." "Then you understand something I don't," she said, "because I've known what I'm sitting on since I planted it, and it hasn't made me want a partner yet." Reeves left that day without an answer, but he did not leave Hollow Bend, and neither did his men. They took to watching the field from a distance, day and night, in shifts, the way a wolf watches a herd it hasn't decided how to approach yet. Winter announced itself early that year with a hard frost in early November, and that frost should have killed Eliza's crop the way it killed everything else struggling to grow in that starved county. It didn't. Her rows stood green and untouched, while every other field within 20 miles went white and brittle overnight. Farmers who had lost their own wheat 3 seasons running walked out to the edge of the Whitfield fence just to stand and look at something that was still, and possibly, alive. That was the morning Hollow Bend stopped being curious and started being desperate, and desperation is a far more dangerous thing than curiosity ever was. A meeting was called at the church, not by the Reverend, but by a farmer named Caleb Dunmore, whose family had worked the county since before it was a county, and whose own fields had failed him 3 years running. He stood at the front of a room packed tighter than it had been for Sunday's service in months, and said the thing that half the town had been thinking but nobody had said aloud. "That woman's crop survived a frost that killed everything else in this county," Dunmore said. "Whatever she's growing, it isn't just valuable. It might be the only thing standing between this town and starvation this winter. And she won't say a word about what it is, or whether she means to share a single ear of it with the people who've lived here their whole lives." Reverend Reed tried to speak reason into the room, reminded them Eliza Coldwater had bought that land fair, had broken no law, owed nobody an explanation for what she chose to plant on her own property. But reason does not carry far in a room full of hungry, frightened people, and by the time the meeting broke up, a plan had taken shape that nobody wanted to say out loud but everybody understood. When harvest came, Hollow Bend was not going to wait politely to be told what Eliza Coldwater had grown, or whether she intended to feed anyone but herself with it. Reeves heard about that meeting within hours. He saw, correctly, that a town's desperation could do the work his own men had failed to do with a cut fence and a night raid. All he had to do now was wait, and let hunger finish what greed had started. The morning Eliza Coldwater began her harvest, half of Hollow Bend was standing at the edge of that broken wire fence before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She came out of her cabin to find them there, Dunmore and a dozen farmers behind him, armed with nothing more than the tools they'd have used on their own dead fields, but standing together in a way that made tools unnecessary. Reeves and his 2 men stood apart from the crowd, watching, waiting for whichever side would break first. Eliza looked at all of them for a long moment. Then she set down her shotgun, not dropped it, set it down, deliberately, on the porch step, and walked out into her rows alone. She began to cut. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody, in that moment, quite had the nerve to be the first to cross a threshold that felt, suddenly, larger than a fence line. They watched her work through the first hour in a silence that had more fear in it than reverence, because not one person there, not Dunmore, not Reeves, not even the Reverend, actually knew what would come up out of that ground when she finally held it in her hands. What came up was wheat. Plain, golden, unremarkable wheat, save for the fact that it had survived a drought that killed every other stalk in the county, and a frost that should have finished the job. Eliza held up a full head of grain, heavy and whole, and let the crowd see it plainly. "This," she said, her voice carrying further than it had any right to across that silent field, "is a strain my grandmother carried out of a dying country 40 years ago, because the wheat there had learned to survive worse ground than this. I have spent 11 years crossing it, season after season, failure after failure, trying to breed something that could grow where nothing else would. I did not tell this town what I was planting because I did not know until 3 weeks ago whether it would work, and I was not going to hand this county false hope on top of everything else it's already lost." She looked at Dunmore, at the farmers behind him, at every hollow, hungry face in that crowd. "I bought this land with money I saved by myself, working land like this alone, since I was 19 years old. I did not owe Hollow Bend an explanation for what I did with my own 60 acres. But I am telling you now, freely, because it's ready, and because none of you deserve to starve for another season over dirt and seed you were too afraid to simply ask me about instead of tearing down my fence in the dark." Nobody in that field said a word for a long moment. It was Reeves who finally broke the silence, and not with grace. "Wheat," he said, and there was real fury in it. 3 years of chasing a rumor collapsing into a single unremarkable stalk of grain. 3 years, and it's wheat. "It's wheat that grows where nothing else will," Eliza said quietly. "In a county that just lost 3 straight seasons to drought, I think that was worth more than whatever you were hoping to find, Mr. Reeves. But I understand men like you don't measure worth the way the rest of us do." Reeves's hand moved toward his coat, toward whatever he was carrying beneath it, but Dunmore stepped between them before it went any further, and behind Dunmore, the rest of the farmers closed the gap, a wall of men and women who had spent 3 years losing everything to weather, and were not about to lose the one thing that might save them to a stranger's greed. "You should ride on," Dunmore said to Reeves, quiet and flat. "This county's got no more use for you than it's got food to spare." Reeves looked at the crowd, did the arithmetic a smart, cornered man does in a heartbeat, and understood the numbers weren't his anymore. He and his 2 men rode out of Hollow Bend before nightfall, and were never seen in that county again. Eliza Coldwater shared that first harvest with every family in Hollow Bend willing to plant it the following spring, not out of guilt, but because, as she told the Reverend, months later, over the jar of preserves he'd finally gotten her to accept, a seed that only survives in one field isn't worth much to anybody, herself included. By the following autumn, Hollow Bend's fields had turned gold with the same hardy strain, rows of it stretching further than the Whitfield plot alone had ever managed. The town that had nearly torn down a stranger's fence out of hunger and fear became, within 3 seasons, one of the more reliably fed towns in that stretch of territory, known, when anyone asked, for a wheat strain that could survive weather that killed everything else, and for the woman who had carried it there and refused to explain herself until she was good and ready. Nobody ever did find out where that strange filed gold coin she'd first paid Osgood Pratt with had truly come from. Eliza never explained that either, and by the time anyone thought to ask again, it no longer seemed to matter half as much as it once had. The broken wheel symbol on those old canvas seed sacks became something of a local mark of pride in Hollow Bend for a generation afterward, stitched onto grain sacks, painted above the door of the mill that eventually got built on the edge of what had once been the Whitfield plot. Nobody outside the county ever learned its true origin. Inside the county, nobody particularly cared to ask anymore. She never did say, in so many words, why she kept silent as long as she had, that first season, but those who knew her best came to understand it wasn't secrecy for its own sake. It was simply this: hope, offered too early and snatched away, does more damage to a starving town than honest silence ever could. She had learned that the hard way, on ground far from Hollow Bend, long before she ever arrived with a wagon full of unmarked seed, and a story nobody was owed until she chose to tell it. By the time she did, the entire frontier didn't just want what she'd grown. They needed it. And for once, in a season that had taken almost everything else from them, that was exactly what she gave. And